The wild stallion lowered its head for the woman everyone sent there to fail. But what did the lonely cowboy see that made him ask her not to leave? Clara stood inside the dusty Montana barn, her hand trembling inches from the black stallion's muzzle as the horse's heavy breath filled the silence. Outside, the townspeople waited for her mistake, but the cowboy watching from the shadows saw something no one else had noticed. And what happened next would leave the entire valley questioning who was truly being saved. Stay with us for this unforgettable story. The winter wind came down from the northern hills and moved through Pine Hollow like it had a mind of its own. It slipped between the wooden buildings along Main Street, pushed against the windows of the small general store, and carried the smell of smoke from the chimneys toward the open fields beyond town. Clara Whitfield stood outside the Pine Hollow Relief Society office with her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had been standing there for nearly a minute after receiving the message to come inside. A small layer of snow rested along the shoulders of her brown wool coat. Her boots were worn at the edges from years of walking between farms and houses where she worked. In one hand, she held the faded gloves she had repaired 3 times herself. She looked at the building in front of her, a place that had once offered her shelter, a place that had once promised she would always have somewhere to go. Then she opened the door. Warm air touched her face. The room smelled of paper, candle wax, and old wood. Shelves lined the walls with jars of preserved food, folded blankets, and carefully organized records of families who needed help. Behind a large oak desk sat Beatrice Hollowell. Mrs. Hollowell was a woman people admired in Pine Hollow. She organized charity drives. She visited sick families. She spoke at church gatherings about kindness and generosity. But Clara had learned long ago that some people could speak about kindness without ever making someone feel loved. "Clara," Beatrice said, without looking up from the papers in front of her, "close the door." Clara did as she was told. For a moment, the only sound was the scratching of Beatrice's pen. "Please sit." Clara lowered herself into the wooden chair across from the desk. She waited. She had always been good at waiting. 6 years earlier, when she first came to Pine Hollow after losing her parents, she had learned quickly that patience made life easier. She learned not to ask for too much, not to complain, not to remind people that she was there. Beatrice finally placed the pen down. "Clara, you are 31 years old now." Clara nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And for the last several years, this organization has provided you with a room, meals, and assistance. I know you have been given opportunities that many others would be grateful for." Clara looked down at her hands, hands that had washed dishes, stitched clothing, planted crops, and carried firewood through cold mornings. "I have always been grateful." Beatrice leaned back. "I am sure you believe that." The words landed softly, almost politely, but Clara felt their weight. Beatrice opened a folder. The Relief Society was never meant to become a permanent arrangement. We help people get back on their feet. I understand. And we believe we have found a way for you to finally become independent. Clara looked up. "A job?" Yes, a small hope appeared before she could stop it. "What kind of work?" Beatrice reached into the folder and pulled out a letter. "The Callaway Ranch is looking for help." Clara listened carefully. She knew the name. Everyone in Pine Hollow knew Ethan Callaway. He owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the Montana Territory. People said he was a man who could ride through a blizzard and never lose his way. They said his ranch hands respected him because he worked harder than anyone else. They also said he rarely smiled and trusted almost nobody. "Mr. Callaway needs someone experienced around horses," Beatrice continued. Clara's expression changed slightly. "Horses?" "I don't know much about horses, Mrs. Hollowell." Beatrice looked up for the first time. Her eyes moved over Clara's face, then down toward her coat, as if measuring everything she saw. "You are strong enough to work in a stable." Clara felt the old familiar feeling return, that feeling of being seen only as something useful, not as a person. "I can clean stalls," Clara said quietly. "I can feed animals. I can learn." "Good." Beatrice pushed the paper across the desk. "Then you will leave tomorrow morning." Clara picked it up. The paper shook slightly in her hand. The words blurred for a second before she focused. Callaway Ridge Ranch, stable assistant, $300, experienced horse handler, preferred. Clara looked back at the page. "Mrs. Hollowell, yes, this says experienced." Beatrice folded her hands. "You will tell Mr. Callaway you are willing to learn." Clara stared at her. "You already told him I was experienced?" Beatrice did not answer directly. "Clara, this is a chance for you. A chance." That was the word people used when they wanted someone to accept something painful. A chance to leave. A chance to stop being a burden. A chance to prove you deserved kindness. From the corner of the room, Thomas Whitfield shifted in his chair. Clara had almost forgotten he was there. Her cousin looked uncomfortable. Thomas had once been the person who brought her food when she was young and alone. He had been the one who repaired the roof of her family's old farmhouse after her father died. But times changed. Money became tight, and kindness became something people could no longer afford. "Clara," Thomas said quietly, "you should take the opportunity." She looked at him. For a moment she hoped he would say something else, something that told her she was not being pushed away. But he only looked down. "Tomorrow morning," Beatrice repeated. Clara folded the paper carefully, not because she accepted it, because she had learned not to destroy things in anger. "When does the wagon leave?" At sunrise, the room became silent. Outside, a horse whinnied somewhere on the street. Clara stood. "I'll go." Beatrice nodded. "I knew you would make the sensible choice." Clara walked toward the door. Her hand rested on the handle. Then Beatrice spoke again. "Clara." She turned. "Try not to embarrass yourself." A pause. "Mr. Callaway has a reputation. He has no patience for people who cannot do the work." Clara said nothing. She simply nodded and left. The cold air hit her immediately. Outside, Pine Hollow continued moving. A wagon rolled past. A man carried sacks of flour into the store. Children chased each other through the snow. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But Clara stood still for a moment, holding the paper against her coat. She knew what people thought. She had heard the whispers: too big, too old, too quiet, too much trouble. She had spent years pretending those words did not hurt. But they did. That evening, Clara packed her belongings in a small canvas bag. There was not much: 2 dresses, a wool sweater, a small sewing kit, a tin cup, and the old Bible her mother had given her when she was a child. Everything she owned fit into one bag. 31 years of life, carried with one hand. Before sunrise, Pine Hollow was covered in pale blue winter light. The wagon waited near the edge of town. Clara climbed aboard and pulled her coat tighter as the driver adjusted the reins. A few people stood nearby. Some offered polite smiles, others looked away. A few whispered. Clara did not listen. The wagon began moving. The wooden wheels rolled over frozen ground, leaving tracks behind her. As Pine Hollow disappeared into the distance, Clara looked ahead toward the mountains. Somewhere beyond those snow-covered peaks was Callaway Ridge Ranch. Somewhere there was a man expecting an experienced horse handler. Somewhere there was a black stallion named Storm. A horse people said no one could control. Clara knew she was walking into a place where she did not belong, but she also knew something else. She had spent her whole life being told she could not do things, and somehow, she was still standing. The wagon climbed higher into the mountains. The wind grew colder, the road grew narrower. And far away, Behind the gates of Callaway Ridge Ranch, a cowboy waited for the person he believed would finally solve his greatest problem. He had no idea the person arriving was the very one everyone else had already decided would fail. Ethan Callaway stood beside the main barn with one gloved hand resting on the wooden fence post. The morning had started clear, but the mountains surrounding the valley held on to the last signs of winter. Snow still covered the higher peaks, shining beneath the pale sunlight. Below them, the ranch stretched across hundreds of acres of frozen grassland, with cattle moving slowly near the far fields and smoke rising from the kitchen chimney behind the main house. Callaway Ridge was a place built through hard work. Every fence rail had been replaced by hand. Every barn beam carried marks from years of weather and use. The ranch did not look pretty in the way wealthy homes back east did. It looked honest. Ethan preferred it that way. He checked the pocket watch hanging from his vest. The wagon was late. That bothered him. Not because he cared about schedules more than people, but because he had spent the last 3 days preparing for the arrival of a man named Walter Briggs. According to the letter from the Pine Hollow Relief Society, Walter Briggs had spent 15 years working with difficult horses. He was experienced, reliable, skilled, exactly what Ethan needed. At the end of the barn stood the reason for it all. A large black stallion watched from behind a reinforced wooden gate. Storm. Even from a distance, the horse carried a presence that made most men step back. His coat was dark as coal. His ears moved constantly, listening to every sound around him. He was not a cruel animal, but he was afraid, and fear had made him dangerous. Ethan had tried everything. Experienced trainers, calm voices, patience, time. Nothing lasted. Storm had accepted no one since the accident, since Daniel Ethan looked away from the stall. He hated how often his thoughts returned there. 3 years had passed, but some mornings it still felt like yesterday. The sound of a horse running, the empty space afterward, the silence that followed him home. A wagon wheel cracked against the frozen road. Ethan turned. Finally. The wagon came slowly through the ranch entrance, pulled by 2 tired horses. The driver looked cold and impatient, clearly eager to finish his route and return to town before the weather changed. Ethan stepped forward. The wagon stopped near the barn. The driver climbed down and pulled open the back. A woman stepped out. Ethan waited, then waited a little longer. Something was wrong. The letter had described a horse handler, a strong man, someone who knew the land. Instead, standing in front of him was a woman wearing a faded brown coat, holding a small canvas bag against her side. She looked nervous, not weak. Ethan noticed that immediately, but nervous. Her boots were covered in road dust. Her cheeks were red from the cold. A few strands of brown hair had escaped from beneath her bonnet. She looked toward the ranch, then toward him. "Mr. Callaway?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I'm Clara Whitfield." The name meant nothing to him. The problem was that the person standing before him looked nothing like the person described in the letter. His jaw tightened. "Where is Walter Briggs?" Clara lowered her eyes. There was the pause, a small one, but Ethan noticed. "He isn't coming." The wind moved between them. "What do you mean?" Clara held the letter tighter. "I mean, I was sent instead." Ethan took the paper from his coat pocket and unfolded it. He read it again, then looked at her. The disappointment on his face was not hidden. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Yes, sir? This letter says you have experience handling difficult horses." Clara swallowed. "I can learn. That is not what I asked." Silence. The driver looked away, suddenly interested in checking the wagon harness. Clara's fingers tightened around her bag. "No, sir." Ethan stared at her. "No, I have not trained horses before." The words seemed to settle heavily in the cold air. Ethan looked toward the mountains, then back at her. For a moment he said nothing. He had dealt with dishonest businessmen, men who lied about cattle numbers and land boundaries, but this was different. Someone had sent a woman into the middle of nowhere with a false promise, and they had sent her directly toward the one thing on his ranch that could not be handled by someone unprepared. "You knew this was a lie?" Clara looked ashamed. "No. Then who did?" She did not answer. Ethan already had his suspicion. The people in Pine Hollow, the ones who always talked about helping others, the ones who rarely looked closely at the people they claimed to protect. He folded the letter. This was supposed to solve a problem. Clara looked at him. "I know, you don't understand." "I think I do." Her answer surprised him. Ethan studied her face. Most people, when confronted by him, either became defensive or tried to explain themselves. Clara did neither. She simply stood there, cold, tired, embarrassed, but still standing. "I did not come here to deceive you, Mr. Calloway," she said quietly. Something in her voice made him pause. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It sounded like someone who had spent years explaining herself and had stopped expecting anyone to believe her. Ethan looked toward the barn. "You should go back to town." Clara's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not surprise, just acceptance. Like she had heard those words before. "The wagon is already gone." Ethan looked behind her. The driver was climbing back onto the seat. "You can ride with him." The driver shook his head. "Sorry, Mr. Calloway. I have another delivery before dark. Can't take her back today." Ethan exhaled slowly. Of course, the mountains were unpredictable. A person could be stranded for days if the weather turned. He looked at Clara. She was trying not to show fear. But he noticed the way she held her bag close, the way her shoulders stiffened against the cold, the way she looked at the empty road behind her. For a moment, he saw something familiar, a person who had nowhere else to go. Ethan did not like that feeling. It reminded him too much of his own loneliness. "You can stay one night," he said. Clara looked up. "Only until the weather clears. I can work. I did not say you were hired." Her lips pressed together. Then she nodded. "Yes, sir." Ethan turned toward the barn. "You will sleep in the small room above the tack shed." "Thank you." He walked a few steps, then stopped. "One more thing." Clara waited. "Stay away from the last stall on the left." Her eyes moved toward the barn. She heard it before she saw it. A deep sound. A restless movement. The heavy shift of a large animal behind wood and iron. "Storm," Ethan said. The name alone carried warning. "He is not like the other horses." Clara looked toward this closed stall door. For just a moment, Ethan thought he saw something in her expression. Not fear, concern, but then it disappeared. "I understand." Ethan nodded. He wanted to believe she did, because Storm was not a horse someone learned about slowly. Storm was the kind of mistake that only happened once. Inside the barn, Ethan showed her where the supplies were kept. The smell of hay, leather, and cold wood filled the air. Clara looked around quietly. She did not touch anything. She did not pretend to know what she was doing. That, more than anything, caught Ethan's attention. Most people tried to impress him. She seemed more interested in understanding. "You will help with cleaning stalls and organizing supplies," he said. "Yes, sir. The work starts before sunrise. I'm used to early mornings." Ethan looked at her. "From what?" Clara hesitated. "Farm work," he waited. She did not explain further. For some reason, he respected that. A person did not always owe their whole story to a stranger. That evening, Clara sat alone in the small room above the tack shed. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a wooden table, a small window looking toward the dark outline of the mountains. She placed her Bible beside the lamp and folded her coat over the chair. Down below, the ranch grew quiet. Then came the sound. A horse moving inside the barn, a heavy hoof against wood. Clara looked toward the window. She could not see Storm, but she knew he was there, the most dangerous horse in Montana. The reason she had been sent here. The reason everyone expected her to fail. Clara rested her hands on the edge of the table. Tomorrow she would work, she would learn. She would do whatever she could, because returning to Pine Hollow was not an option. Not after everyone had already decided she belonged nowhere. Across the ranch, Ethan stood outside Storm's stall. The black stallion watched him silently. For years, Ethan had believed the horse was the only thing on the ranch he could not fix. Now there was another problem. A woman had arrived carrying a lie she did not create, and somehow he had allowed her to stay. He did not know why. He only knew one thing. By morning, Clara Whitfield would discover what life at Callaway Ridge truly demanded. And Ethan Callaway would discover that the person he expected to fail might be the first person who ever truly understood his ranch. The first sound Clara heard was not a rooster, it was the wind. It pushed against the thin window above the tack shed, carrying the sharp smell of snow and pine through the cracks in the old wooden frame. For a few seconds, she remained still beneath the wool blanket, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. Then she remembered. Callaway Ridge Ranch, the mountains, the stallion named Storm, the reason she was there. Clara sat up slowly and dressed before the sun appeared over the ridge. Her coat was still cold from hanging overnight. Her boots felt stiff when she pulled them on. She tied her hair back, folded the blanket neatly, and stepped outside with the same quiet habit she had carried for years. Leave a place cleaner than you found it. It was a small thing. But small things were what she knew. The ranch was already awake. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The cattle moved in the distance. A few ranch hands crossed the yard carrying buckets and tools, their boots pressing into the frozen ground. Conversations slowed when they noticed her. Clara felt their eyes. She had known that feeling since childhood, the extra second people took when looking at her, the quiet calculation, the assumption that they already knew everything about her. A tall ranch hand with a gray beard leaned against a fence post. "You the new stable help?" Clara stopped. "Yes." The man looked toward the barn, then back at her. "Thought we were getting a horseman." Another younger worker laughed under his breath. "Maybe the letter got mixed up." Clara heard them. She also heard the sound of a barn door opening behind her. Ethan stepped outside. The ranch hands immediately became quieter. Not because he demanded silence, because Ethan Callaway carried a kind of authority that did not need to be announced. "Her name is Clara," Ethan said. The older ranch hand straightened. "Yes, Mr. Callaway, she works here now." The man nodded. "No apology, no welcome, just acceptance." Ethan looked at Clara. "The stalls need cleaning." She followed his gaze toward the barn. "How many?" "All of them." Clara glanced inside. The barn was larger than it had seemed the night before. Rows of stalls stretched along both sides. Saddles hung neatly on the walls. Tools rested where they belonged. Hay filled the storage area near the back. It was not just a barn. It was a system, a place where everything had a purpose. "I'll start." Ethan watched her for a moment. "You should know something." Clara turned. "The work here is not easy. I know." "No," he said calmly. "You don't." The words were not cruel, just honest. "The winters are long, the hours are longer. If you cannot do this, there is no shame in saying so." Clara held his gaze. For the first time since arriving, Ethan noticed something different in her expression. Not confidence, not pride, something quieter, resolve. "I have spent most of my life doing things people told me I could not do," she said. Then she picked up the pitchfork leaning against the wall. "I suppose one more will not hurt." Ethan did not answer. but he stayed there a moment longer than necessary. Then he walked away. The first day was harder than Clara expected. The work was not complicated. That almost made it worse. There was no trick, no shortcut, only repetition. The stalls needed cleaning. The feed bins needed filling. The water troughs needed scrubbing. By mid-morning, her gloves were damp and her shoulders ached. A young ranch hand named Caleb Reed watched her struggle with a heavy feed sack near the storage room. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. Clara looked over. "I'm not trying to." "Then why are you still carrying that?" She looked down at the sack. "Because it needs to be carried." Caleb had no answer for that. He walked away, but later, when she returned to the storage room, she found the heavier sacks moved closer to the front. She knew he had done it. She also knew he would never admit it. By afternoon, Ethan found Clara repairing a loose latch on one of the smaller stalls. She had removed the broken hinge pin, cleaned the rust, and replaced it with a spare piece from the toolbox. He stopped. "You know how to do that?" Clara looked up. "My father taught me." Ethan nodded. He noticed the small cuts along her fingers. "You should use gloves." "I did." He looked at the worn pair beside her. "They are too thin." Clara looked at them, then shrugged. "They were what I had." Ethan said nothing. But the next morning, when Clara entered the barn, a new pair of leather work gloves sat on the shelf beside her tools. No note, no explanation. She picked them up. They were exactly her size. Clara looked toward the house. The curtains on the upstairs window moved slightly. She wondered if Ethan had been standing there. She smiled faintly, then she put the gloves on. Days passed. The ranch settled into a new rhythm. Clara woke before sunrise. She worked until the light faded. At night, she sat near the small stove in the tack shed room and repaired clothing by lamplight. She did not complain. That was what surprised Ethan most. He had expected anger, excuses, a request to leave. Instead, Clara simply adjusted, learned where the feed was stored. She learned which horses disliked sudden movements. She learned that the old gray mare in the third stall preferred water from the smaller bucket because the metal one made too much noise. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything, especially the horses, and slowly he noticed her. One morning, he watched Clara stand beside a nervous young horse. She did not pull the reins. She did not force the animal to move. She simply waited. Minutes passed. The horse finally stepped closer. Ethan stood near the fence, silent. "You have a strange way with them," he said. Clara turned. "I do. They listen to you." She looked toward the horse. "Maybe they just know when someone is afraid." Ethan looked at her. The answer stayed with him. That evening, the ranch hands gathered near the cookhouse after supper. The smell of coffee filled the cold air. Someone mentioned Storm. "Still locked up?" "Always will be," another answered. Clara sat quietly at the edge of the room, listening. "He's not a horse anymore," one man said. Ethan entered before anyone noticed. The room became silent. He looked toward the stallion's direction through the window. Enough. Nobody argued. But Clara saw something in Ethan's face, something hidden beneath the calm, something heavier than anger. Later that night, she walked past the barn on her way back to the tack shed. She stopped. The last stall stood at the far end. The door was reinforced with thick wood and iron. Storm was inside. She could hear him breathing. Clara did not step closer. She remembered Ethan's warning, "Stay away." So she stayed where she was. But for a moment, she wondered. What had happened to make everyone afraid of him? And what had happened to Ethan Calloway that made him afraid too? Inside the house, Ethan stood near the window watching her leave. He expected her to quit. He expected the cold, the work, and the loneliness to send her back to Pine Hollow. But Clara Whitfield was still there, still waking before dawn, still carrying more than anyone expected, still refusing to become the failure everyone had planned for her to be. And Ethan did not know whether that bothered him or impressed him. Maybe both, because for the first time in years, someone had walked onto Callaway Ridge Ranch and looked past the fences, past the reputation, past the locked stall at the end of the barn. And Ethan Callaway was beginning to wonder what else she might see. The answer came sooner than he expected. The storm arrived 3 days later. It rolled down from the mountains just before sunset, bringing heavy clouds and a wind that shook the windows of the ranch house. The cattle had already been moved closer to shelter. The ranch hands checked the fences one final time before darkness settled over Callaway Ridge. Clara stood near the kitchen doorway, watching the sky turn the color of old steel. "Looks like a rough night," Caleb Reed said as he hung his coat near the door. Ethan glanced outside. "It will pass by morning," Caleb gave a small laugh. "You always say that, and usually I'm right." The ranch hands smiled quietly. It was one of the few times Clara had seen Ethan almost appear like an ordinary man. Almost. Then a sound came from the barn, a heavy oodar against wood. Everyone stopped. The room went silent. Another sound followed, the horses, restless, uneasy. Ethan was already moving before anyone spoke. "Stay inside." Clara watched him grab his coat. "What about the horses?" I said. "Stay inside." His voice was firm, not angry, but there was something underneath it. Fear. Clara had heard that tone before. Not from him, from people trying to hide that they were afraid. Ethan stepped into the storm. For a moment, Clara remained near the doorway. Then she heard it again, a loud crash from the barn, not a normal movement, something desperate. She pulled on her coat. The cold air hit her immediately as she crossed the yard. The wind made it hard to walk. Snow and rain mixed together, stinging her face. When she reached the barn, she found Ethan near the far stall. Storm was inside. The large black stallion moved back and forth, striking the ground, breathing heavily. The reinforced wooden door shook. Ethan stood several feet away, not approaching, not forcing, just watching. "Ethan." He turned sharply. "What are you doing here? The horses are scared. Go back." Clara looked toward Storm. The horse pressed against the back of the stall. His ears moved quickly. His body was tense, but something caught Clara's attention. "He's not angry." Ethan looked at her. "What?" "He's scared." The words surprised him. Clara stepped closer, but stopped well before the stall. She did not reach for the door. She did not move suddenly. She simply watched. Storm turned his head toward her. The horse's breathing was still heavy, but his attention changed. "He's listening," Clara said softly. Ethan shook his head. "No one listens to Storm." Clara looked at him. "Maybe no one has tried." The barn became quiet except for the wind outside. Ethan stared at her. For a moment he seemed ready to argue, then he stopped. Because Clara was not looking at Storm like he was a problem. She was looking at him like he was hurt, the same way she looked at people. Clara moved to an overturned wooden crate and sat down several feet away from the stall. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing? Waiting. For what? For him to stop being afraid." Ethan almost laughed. Almost, but he didn't, because she said it with such certainty. Not arrogance, not foolishness, just patience. So he stayed. The storm continued outside. The old barn creaked and groaned with every strong gust. Clara sat quietly. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she began speaking, not loudly, not as if trying to command the horse, just talking. "I know this place is strange." Storm's ears moved. Clara looked down at her hands. "When I first came here, I thought everyone already knew who I was." Ethan stood against a support beam, listening despite himself. "I thought maybe I could work hard enough and people would stop expecting me to fail." She gave a small smile. "But I suppose people believe what they want to believe." Storm shifted. Clara continued. "I know what it feels like when people decide something about you, before they know you." Ethan's expression changed slightly. Those words were not meant only for the horse. The hours passed. The fire in the lantern near the door burned lower. One by one, the ranch hands left, but Ethan remained, and Clara remained. Neither of them spoke about leaving. Near midnight, something changed. Storm stopped moving. The heavy breathing slowed. The stall became quiet. Clara noticed first. She looked toward Ethan. The two of them exchanged a glance. No words. They both understood. Ethan stepped closer, slowly, carefully. Storm did not react. The horse simply watched Clara. Ethan looked at the animal he had spent years fearing. Then he looked at the woman sitting beside him. "I have seen trained men spend weeks trying to do what you did tonight." Clara lowered her eyes. "I didn't do anything." Ethan looked at her. That might be exactly why. She looked confused. "You didn't try to force him." A pause. "You listened." The wind continued outside. But inside the barn, everything felt different. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight reached through the clouds and spread across the snow-covered valley. The ranch looked almost peaceful. Clara was carrying a bucket of water when she noticed Ethan standing near the barn. He held something in his hand. Her gloves, the old ones, the ones that had started falling apart. "You left these near the wash basin." Clara looked at them. "I thought I lost them." Ethan handed them over, but before she took them, she noticed something. The torn stitching had been repaired. She looked at him. "You fixed them?" Ethan seemed almost uncomfortable. They were still usable. Clara looked down at the gloves. A small smile appeared. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once, then he turned away, but he stopped after a few steps. "Clara." She looked up. "Yes," he hesitated. "Only for a second. About last night." She waited. Ethan looked toward the barn. Storm has never acted that way with anyone. Clara followed his gaze. Maybe he was just tired. A faint change crossed Ethan's face. Not quite a smile, but close, maybe. He walked away. Clara watched him go. For the first time since arriving at Callaway Ridge, she wondered if Ethan Callaway was not as cold as everyone claimed. Maybe he was just a man who had forgotten how to trust. And maybe Storm was not the only one behind a locked door. That evening, Ethan stood alone outside the stall. Storm watched him quietly. The horse that had rejected every person who came near him had changed. Only slightly, but enough. Ethan looked toward the main house, toward the small window above the tack shed where Clara's lamp burned. He had expected her to fail. He had expected another disappointment. Instead, the woman everyone sent away had done something no one else could. She had made the impossible seem possible. And Ethan Callaway had a question he did not want to answer. What if Clara Whitfield had not come to Callaway Ridge to fix his horse? What if she had come to show him something about himself? Ethan Callaway found himself asking that question more often than he wanted to admit. Not out loud, never out loud. But in the quiet moments between morning chores and evening rounds, when the ranch settled beneath the wide Montana sky, and there was nothing left to distract him. Clara had been at Callaway Ridge for nearly a month. A month was not a long time. Not enough to know a person completely, but long enough to notice when someone changed the rhythm of a place. And Clara had changed the rhythm of his ranch. Not through grand gestures, not by demanding attention. She simply became part of the landscape. The same way the old cottonwood trees stood near the creek, the same way the lanterns outside the barn were lit every evening. She was just there, every morning before sunrise, every evening after the last horse was fed. The ranch hands had stopped watching her like they expected her to leave. They still did not talk much around her. That was simply how men on the frontier often were. But the small things had changed. Caleb Reed no longer left the heaviest feed sacks where only the strongest men could reach them. Old Walter Crane, who had worked cattle longer than most men in Pine Hollow had been alive, started asking Clara what she thought about the horses. Nobody announced these changes, nobody admitted them, they just happened. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. One afternoon, he found Clara near the north fence line repairing a section damaged by the winter wind. She had her coat tied around her waist, sleeves rolled past her wrists, and a small hammer resting beside her. The ground was still damp from melting snow. "You should have asked for help." Clara looked up. She brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "I was almost finished." Ethan looked at the fence. She was right. The broken boards had been replaced neatly. The wire had been tightened properly. "You know how to do fence work, my father taught me." Ethan nodded. He remembered she had mentioned farm work before, but she never spoke much about her past. Most people wanted others to know their hardships. Clara carried hers quietly. "How many years did you work on that farm?" She looked back toward the mountains. "Most of my life. Must have been difficult." A small smile touched her face. Some days, Ethan waited. She did not continue. He realized she was not asking him to feel sorry for her. She was simply answering. That was different. Most people around him either wanted something or wanted him to understand something. Clara seemed comfortable letting silence exist. He found that unusual and strangely peaceful. "You missed a nail." She looked down. A small laugh escaped her. "Did I?" Ethan stepped closer and picked up the hammer. Without thinking, he handed it to her. "Here." Their hands touched briefly. Neither moved immediately. Then Clara took the hammer. "Thank you." Ethan nodded and stepped back. It was a simple moment, nothing important. At least that was what he told himself. That evening, Clara found a small wooden box outside the tack shed. Inside were several items: a better sewing needle, a small tin of hand salve, and a new pair of work socks. She looked around the empty yard. Nobody else was there. No note, no explanation. She knew. The next morning, Ethan was checking the horses when Clara approached him. "Mr. Calloway." He looked over. "Yes?" She held the small tin in her hand. "Thank you." His eyes moved to the salve. It was nothing. It wasn't. Ethan looked away. It was practical. Clara smiled slightly. Sometimes practical things mean the most. For a moment, Ethan had no answer, so he returned to brushing the horse in front of him. But Clara noticed something. The corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. A week later, Ethan began teaching her more about horses, not because he believed she needed to prove herself, because he realized she wanted to understand. There was a difference. He showed her how to recognize when a horse was uncomfortable. "The ears tell you more than people think," he explained one morning. Clara stood beside him near the corral. "How?" "When they are relaxed, they move naturally." He pointed toward a chestnut mare. "When they are afraid, they become still." Clara watched carefully, and Storm, Ethan became quiet. The question changed the air between them. Storm is different because of what happened. Ethan looked at her. She knew, not the details, not yet, but enough. He looked away. Yes. Clara did not ask more. That surprised him. Most people pushed. They wanted the story. They wanted to know about the accident, the brother, the horse. Clara simply accepted the answer he gave. That evening, they ate supper at the same table for the first time. Before that, Clara usually ate after the ranch hands finished. Ethan had never told her to. She had simply assumed. But when he entered the dining room and saw her standing near the kitchen door with her plate, he stopped. "You're eating there?" Clara looked confused. "Yes." "Why?" She hesitated. "I thought that was how things were done." Ethan looked at the empty chair across from him. "Sit." The word was simple, but Clara understood what it meant. She sat. The room was quiet, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Ethan poured coffee into her cup. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that. I know." That answer surprised her. He returned to his meal. For a while they ate without speaking. Then Clara asked, "Did your brother like this place?" Ethan's hand stopped. The question could have hurt, but somehow, from her, it did not. "He loved it." A pause. "He was better with horses than me." Clara looked at him. "I find that hard to believe." Ethan looked up. "Why? Because you pay attention." For a moment he did not speak. Nobody had described him that way before. Strong, successful, difficult, cold. Those were words he knew, but attentive? No. That was different. Outside, snow melted from the roof and dripped onto the porch. Inside, the fire burned low, and something between them shifted quietly. Not enough to name, not enough to understand, but enough. Later that night, Ethan walked past the tack shed. He saw light beneath Clara's door. He expected she was reading. Instead, he found her sitting at the small table, repairing one of the ranch hand's torn shirts. "You're working after working all day?" Clara looked up. It was torn. Ethan frowned. "You don't have to fix everything." She lowered the shirt into her lap. No a pause. "But I can." The answer stayed with him, because he realized something. Clara did not help because she wanted praise. She helped because it was simply who she was. The next morning, Ethan found himself waiting near the barn before sunrise. He told himself it was because of the horses, because there was work to do, because the ranch required attention. But when Clara walked across the yard carrying her coffee mug, he looked up before he meant to. She noticed. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. Then Ethan looked away. "Cold morning." Clara glanced at the sky. "It is," a pause, "but it feels warmer than when I arrived." Ethan looked back at her. He knew she was talking about more than the weather, and for the first time in years, he wondered if Callaway Ridge had been cold because of the winter, or because he had made it that way. Across the yard, behind the locked stall, Storm watched them quietly. The horse that trusted no one stood still. And Ethan Callaway, the man who had spent years protecting himself from loss, began to realize the most dangerous thing on his ranch was not a wild stallion. It was the possibility that he might finally have something worth losing. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself looking forward to ordinary moments. A cup of coffee before sunrise, the sound of boots crossing the porch, the quiet movement of someone working in the barn. Things he once considered meaningless had somehow become part of the rhythm of Callaway Ridge, and he knew exactly when it started. The day Clara Whitfield sat outside Storm's stall during the storm and refused to see him as a dangerous animal. She had seen fear, not anger, not violence, fear. That stayed with him, because Ethan knew fear better than most men. He simply wore his differently. Spring came slowly to the Montana Valley. The snow along the lower fields began to disappear, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. The creek near the eastern fence started running again, carrying melted water down from the mountains. The ranch became busy. There were fences to repair, cattle to check, supplies to order before the next season. Clara moved through it all like she had always belonged there. That was the part Ethan struggled with, not because he disliked it, because he did. He liked seeing her near the barn. He liked hearing her ask questions. He liked the way she spoke to the horses, as if every creature deserved patience, and he hated that he liked it. Ethan Callaway had spent years building a life where nothing could surprise him. A ranch, a routine, a set of rules. Then Clara arrived with a worn bag and a quiet voice. And suddenly his carefully built world had cracks in it. Not broken cracks, the kind that let light through. One afternoon, Ethan found Clara near the far pasture. She stood beside the fence, watching Storm. The stallion had been moved outside into a separate enclosure, where he could see the open land without being near the other horses. He was still cautious. still powerful, still not ready to trust completely. But he no longer reacted every time someone walked past. That alone was something Ethan never thought he would see. "You're watching him again." Clara turned. Ethan stood several feet away, holding a leather glove in one hand. She smiled slightly. "Maybe he's watching me too." Ethan looked toward Storm. The horse stood still, ears forward. "He probably is." Clara rested her hands on the fence. "He seems lonely." Ethan's expression changed. Lonely? Yes. The answer was simple. Too simple, but it caught him. Most people described Storm with words like dangerous, unpredictable, impossible. Nobody had ever called him lonely. Ethan looked at the horse for a long moment. Then he looked away. Storm wasn't always like this. Clara did not move. She waited. That was something Ethan had noticed about her. She never pulled words from him, she simply left room for them. A person could fill that silence if they wanted, or walk away. Ethan looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. His name used to belong to someone else. Clara's eyes softened. "Your brother," Ethan nodded. The wind moved through the pasture. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan opened the gate. "Come with me." Clara followed him toward the barn. The familiar smell of hay and leather surrounded them as they walked inside. Ethan stopped near Storm's stall, the same stall he had repaired more times than he could count, the same place where he had spent countless nights standing alone. Daniel loved this horse. Clara stayed quiet. He found him as a young colt. Everyone told him the horse was too wild, too difficult. A faint sadness crossed Ethan's face. Daniel never cared what people thought about something. Clara looked at Storm. "Sounds familiar." Ethan glanced at her. For a moment, something almost like a smile appeared. Then it disappeared. He spent years training him. Ethan rested his hand on the wooden beam beside the stall. Storm trusted him. His voice became quieter, more than anyone. Clara noticed the change, not just in his words, in the way he stood, the way his shoulders carried something heavy. "What happened?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked toward the stall. 3 years had passed. 3 years since he had spoken about it. 3 years since he allowed himself to remember more than the ending. It was during a storm. The barn seemed quieter. Daniel went out late to check the horses. Ethan swallowed. He thought he understood Storm better than anyone. A pause. And maybe he did. Clara listened. He was found the next morning. Ethan's voice stayed controlled, but his hand tightened against the wood. After that, everyone said the horse was dangerous. Clara looked at him. "And you believed them?" Ethan did not answer right away. Finally, he said, "I needed to." The honesty of those words surprised even him. Clara understood. You needed someone to blame. Ethan looked at her, not offended, just tired. Yes, the admission hung between them. A man like Ethan Calloway did not easily admit weakness. But Clara did not look at him differently. She did not pity him. She simply stood there. "You kept him because of Daniel." Ethan nodded. "I couldn't get rid of him because you loved your brother." A long silence followed. Then Clara stepped closer to the stall, not inside, not near enough to risk frightening Storm, just close enough to see him clearly. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people hold on to pain because letting it go feels like letting someone go too." Ethan looked at her. The words reached somewhere he had kept locked away. "He's not Daniel," she continued. Ethan looked toward Storm. "No, and you're not the same man you were that day." The barn became still. Outside, a bird called from the fence line. Ethan lowered his eyes. For years, he had believed moving forward meant forgetting. So he stayed still. He stayed angry. He stayed alone, because loneliness felt easier than accepting he could not change what happened. Clara looked at Storm. He doesn't need punishment. Then she looked back at Ethan. Neither do you. Ethan did not speak. He could not because he disagreed, because some truths were harder to hear than lies. That evening, Clara sat near the kitchen stove repairing a loose button on her coat. Ethan entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her. She looked up. "Thank you." He nodded. Then he sat across from her. For a while neither spoke. The silence between them was different now, not empty, not uncomfortable. It carried things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I should have told you sooner." Clara looked at him. "About Daniel? Yes." She shook her head gently. "You weren't ready." Ethan studied her. "How do you know?" "Because I wasn't ready to tell you my story either." That answer stayed with him, because he realized something. Clara was not just patient with horses. She was patient with people, especially broken ones. Outside, Storm stood quietly in his pasture. For the first time in years, Ethan did not look at him and see the worst day of his life. He saw a horse, a living creature, something that had survived. And inside the small ranch house, across from a woman who had been sent there as a joke, Ethan Calloway began to understand the truth he had avoided for years. The thing that needed saving was never just the horse behind the locked stall. It was the man who had locked himself away with him. For several weeks after Ethan finally spoke about Daniel, something between him and Clara changed. Not suddenly, not in a way anyone else would notice. There were no grand declarations, no promises made beneath the stars. Life on a ranch did not leave much room for such things. There were horses to feed, fences to mend, cattle to check before the next storm. But small things changed. Ethan no longer walked past Clara without stopping. He asked her opinion when checking the horses. He listened when she answered. And Clara no longer looked at Calloway Ridge as a place where she had been sent. It was becoming something else, a place where she had a purpose, a place where people knew her name, a place where, for the first time in years, she was not waiting for someone to decide when she had to leave. But outside the ranch gates, people were talking, and not everyone was happy. The rumors started in Pine Hollow. At first, they were small. A comment at the general store, a whisper near the church steps, a conversation that stopped when someone walked by. Then they grew. People said Calloway had lost his judgment. They said he had become too attached to a woman who had no experience with horses. They said Storm was still dangerous, and Clara's luck would eventually run out. And behind many of those conversations stood Nathaniel Brooks. Nathaniel owned the Brooks Valley Ranch, 3 miles south of Calloway Ridge. He was the kind of man who always looked polished. His boots were always clean. His coat was always pressed. His horse always looked freshly groomed. But beneath that careful appearance was a man who had spent years wanting what Ethan had: land, respect, a reputation. Calloway Ridge sat on some of the best grazing ground in the territory. Nathaniel had offered to buy portions of it before. Ethan had always refused. That refusal had never left Nathaniel's mind. One afternoon, Nathaniel sat inside the Pine Hollow diner drinking coffee, while 2 ranch owners listened nearby. "You know what I find interesting?" Nathaniel said. The older man across from him looked up. "What's that?" Ethan Calloway spent years searching for someone to handle that stallion. Nathaniel stirred sugar into his coffee. Experienced men came and went. He smiled slightly. Then suddenly a woman arrives from a charity house, and somehow she succeeds where everyone else failed. The other man shrugged. "Maybe she's just good with animals." Nathaniel leaned back. "Or maybe Ethan wants to believe that." The words sat there, simple, carefully chosen. A few days later, a letter arrived at Calloway Ridge. Ethan read it near the kitchen table. Clara noticed his expression change. "What is it?" He folded the paper. "Nothing." She looked at him. She had learned enough about him to know when he was avoiding something. It doesn't look like nothing. Ethan placed the letter down. The Pine Hollow cattle gathering is next week. Clara nodded. She knew about it. Every spring, ranch owners from the valley gathered to discuss cattle prices, supplies, and land agreements. What does that have to do with the letter? Ethan hesitated, then he handed it to her. Clara read slowly. It was an invitation. But underneath the polite words was something else. A challenge. Nathaniel Brooks had written that he hoped to see Storm during the gathering. He wanted proof that the horse was truly under control. Clara looked up. He doesn't believe you. No, or he doesn't want to. Ethan said nothing. That was answer enough. The morning of the gathering arrived with clear skies. The ranch was busier than usual. Several riders arrived from nearby properties. Wagons rolled through the gate carrying families and supplies. The smell of fresh coffee and cooked meat drifted from the outdoor tables near the barn. Clara stayed near the horses. She had no desire to stand in the middle of town conversations. She had lived through enough people deciding who she was without knowing her. But avoiding attention did not always mean attention avoided her. Near midday, Nathaniel arrived. He stepped down from his horse wearing a dark coat and a confident smile. Ethan. The two men shook hands. The gesture was polite. Nothing more. Nathaniel, I hear the ranch is doing well. It is. Nathaniel looked around. Then his eyes settled on Clara. She was carrying a bucket near the barn. The smile on his face changed. Not much, just enough. And I see your new helper is still here. Ethan's expression hardened. She works hard, I'm sure she does. Nathaniel looked back toward the others. People around town are curious. About what? About whether this arrangement is practical. Clara heard enough. She kept walking, but the words followed. Some folks think you're letting kindness interfere with good judgment. Ethan stepped closer. Choose your next words carefully. Nathaniel smiled. There it is. What? That old temper. A few men nearby became quiet. Nathaniel lowered his voice. I'm only saying what everyone else is thinking. Ethan looked at him. No, you're saying what benefits you. The smile disappeared slightly. Then Nathaniel looked toward the barn. Fine, he raised his voice. Let's settle it. The people nearby turned. Bring out the horse. The air changed. Clara stopped. Ethan immediately shook his head. No, Nathaniel smiled. Why not? Because Storm is not a performance? Interesting, Nathaniel looked around. You used to say that horse was your greatest challenge. He paused. Now you won't even show him? The crowd became silent. Clara saw Ethan's hands tighten at his sides. This was not about the horse. It was about pride, about Daniel, about every wound Ethan had carried. Before he could answer, Clara stepped forward. Mr. Brooks. Everyone looked at her. Nathaniel turned. Yes? Clara stood calmly. Storm is not something to prove. Nathaniel studied her. And yet you are the person everyone says understands him. She said nothing because she knew what he was doing. He wanted anger. He wanted embarrassment. He wanted her to react. Instead, she simply looked at him. He is an animal, not a story for people to tell. A few people exchanged glances. Nathaniel smiled faintly, perhaps. Then he looked at Ethan. But maybe tomorrow the valley should see whether this miracle is real. The word miracle sounded like an insult. That evening, the ranch was unusually quiet. The guests had left. The lanterns outside the barn burned low. Clara found Ethan near the fence line. You're angry. No. She looked at him. He sighed. Fine, I am. She stood beside him. You don't have to prove anything, I know. Then why does it bother you? Ethan looked across the fields. Because I know what they think. Clara was quiet. They think I'm weak. The words surprised him. He looked at her. she continued. They think I'm here because someone felt sorry for me. A pause. But I know what I've done. Ethan watched her. You do? Chess. Her voice stayed calm. I cleaned those stalls. I learned those horses. I stayed when everyone expected me to leave. The wind moved through the grass. I don't need them to believe me. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Neither do I. It was the closest thing to comfort he knew how to give. And Clara understood. But the next morning, Nathaniel Brooks returned, and he did not come alone. He brought half the valley with him. Men who wanted to see Storm, people who wanted to know if the rumors were true, people who had already decided what they expected to happen. And standing among them was Beatrice Hollowell, the woman who had sent Clara away, the woman who had expected her to return embarrassed and defeated. Beatrice looked at Clara, then at Ethan. Her expression was calm, almost satisfied. Mr. Calloway, she said, we need to discuss something. Ethan's eyes narrowed, because in that moment, he understood. The horse was never the only battle coming to Calloway Ridge. The real battle was standing right in front of him. A woman who had spent her whole life being told she did not belong, and a town full of people who were ready to believe the same thing. The morning air felt colder than usual. The sun had barely risen above the mountains when the first wagons arrived at Calloway Ridge. Horses moved through the ranch gate, their hooves pressing into the damp earth. Men climbed down from their saddles. Families gathered near the barn. Conversations drifted across the yard like smoke. Everyone had come to see Storm, but Clara knew the truth. They had come to see her fail. She stood near the side of the barn holding a bucket of water, watching as Nathaniel Brooks spoke with several ranch owners. He smiled. He shook hands. He looked like a man welcoming friends. But Clara had learned enough about people to recognize when kindness was only a coat worn over something colder. Beatrice Hollowell stood beside him. Her dark blue dress was perfectly arranged. Her gloves were clean. Her expression carried the same calm confidence she always wore inside the Relief Society office. The same confidence she had when she told Clara she was no longer welcome. Clara looked away. She returned to work. That was what she had always done. When people whispered, she worked. When people judged, she worked. When people decided they already knew her story, she worked. But this time was different. Because Ethan was standing between her and the people who wanted to see her broken, and that made everything harder. Near the barn entrance, Nathaniel raised his voice. Mr. Calloway. Ethan turned. Yes? Nathaniel gestured toward the crowd. People have traveled a long way. Ethan's expression remained still. For what? Nathaniel smiled. To see whether the stories are true. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Clara felt it, that familiar feeling, being watched, being measured, being reduced to something people could discuss over coffee. Nathaniel continued. They say your stallion has changed. Ethan said nothing. They say this woman helped you accomplish what trained horsemen could not. His eyes moved toward Clara. People are curious. Beatrice stepped forward. Clara has always had a good heart. The words sounded pleasant, but Clara knew better. Beatrice continued. But kindness is not the same as skill. The crowd became quiet. Ethan's face hardened. Enough. Beatrice looked at him. I'm only speaking the truth. No, his voice was low. You're speaking what you want people to believe. A few people looked between them. Beatrice's smile faded slightly. You seem very protective of her. Ethan stepped forward. That is because she has earned respect. The words were simple, but Clara heard them, and so did everyone else. Nathaniel looked amused. Respect? He glanced around. She arrived here because a letter claimed she knew how to handle horses. A pause. But that letter was wrong. Clara lowered her eyes. Because he was right, The letter had been a lie, even if she had not written it, even if she had not asked for it. The lie still followed her. Nathaniel continued. She was sent here under false information. The crowd shifted. She was never the person you were promised. Ethan's jaw tightened. She was never the problem. Nathaniel looked at him. Maybe not. Then he turned toward Clara. Perhaps you should explain why everyone else was wrong about you. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara felt every pair of eyes. She could have defended herself. She could have listed everything she had done: the fences, the stalls, the horses, the long mornings, the cold nights, the blisters on her hands, the hours nobody saw. But suddenly, she was tired. Tired of proving she deserved a place. Tired of standing in front of people who had already decided. Before she could answer, Ethan spoke. She does not owe you an explanation. Clara looked at him. Something in his voice was different. Not anger. Not pride. Something deeper. Protection. Nathaniel noticed too. And he smiled, because he had found the thing he wanted. Not the horse, not the ranch, the connection between them. Interesting, Nathaniel said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Careful. Nathaniel laughed softly. No insult intended. But there was one. Everyone heard it. By late afternoon, the visitors finally left. The ranch became quiet again. Too quiet. Clara returned to the tack shed room without saying much. She packed slowly. One dress, the Bible, the small sewing kit, the tin cup, the same things she had carried when she arrived. She folded each item carefully, not because she wanted to leave, because she had learned not to wait until someone else forced her out. A knock came at the door. She knew who it was. Come in. Ethan opened the door. He stopped when he saw the bag on the bed. For a moment, neither spoke. You're leaving. It was not a question. Clara continued folding. I think it is best. No. She looked up. The firmness in his voice surprised her. Ethan, no. Stepped inside. Tell me why. Clara looked away. Because they were right about one thing. His expression changed. What thing? I was not what you needed. That is not true. It is. Her voice remained calm. That almost made it worse. They sent you someone who did not know horses. Someone who had never worked with an animal like Storm. She looked around the small room. This place became important to me. A pause. But I know what I am. Ethan moved closer. Do you? She looked at him. I am the person people send away when they do not know what else to do with me. The words were quiet, but they hit harder than anger. Ethan stood still, because suddenly he understood. This was not about Nathaniel. It was not about Beatrice. It was not even about the town. It was about every person who had made Clara feel like she was temporary, like she could be replaced, like she had to earn every kindness. I never looked at you that way. Clara gave a small, sad smile. Smile, I know. That answer surprised him. You know? Yes. Then why leave? She looked down. Because knowing you are different from them does not mean I can forget they exist. The room became silent. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Ethan had faced storms. He had faced angry men. He had faced losing everything. But standing there, watching Clara prepare to walk away, he felt something he had not felt in years. Helplessness, Clara. She stopped. I did not keep you here because I needed a worker. Her eyes lifted. I kept you here because this ranch changed when you arrived. She looked at him. The horses changed. A pause. And so did I. Ethan rarely struggled for words. But now he did. I spent years thinking I had to carry everything alone. He swallowed. Then you came here. Clara's expression softened. You sat outside that stall when everyone else walked away. His voice lowered. You saw something in Storm that I couldn't see. He stepped closer, and you saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. Clara looked at him. The man who had once stood behind a cold wall was standing there without it. Not completely, but enough. I don't want you to stay because you feel sorry for me, she whispered. I don't. I don't want to be another responsibility. You're not. The answer came immediately. You are the first person in years who made this place feel like home. Clara looked down. A tear slipped silently onto her hand. She quickly wiped it away. Ethan noticed, but he did not mention it. He only stood there, giving her the choice, because that was the difference between him and everyone else. He was not asking her to stay because she had nowhere else to go. He was asking because he wanted her there. Finally, Clara reached for the bag, then stopped. She looked at it, at the life she had carried inside it. Then she slowly set it back down, not because the world had changed, not because the town had accepted her, but because one man had finally seen her. Outside, Storm stood quietly in his pasture, the same horse everyone feared, the same horse everyone misunderstood. And inside the small room above the tack shed, Clara Whitfield made the first choice in years that belonged entirely to her. She stayed. But neither she nor Ethan knew that the hardest test was still ahead, because the people who had sent Clara away were not finished with their plan, and by morning, Beatrice Hollowell would return to Callaway Ridge with documents in her hand, and a claim that could change everything. But before that happened, the valley had one more thing to see. Spring had fully arrived in Montana. The snow had disappeared from the lower fields, leaving behind dark earth and fresh grass. The mountains still wore white along their peaks, but the air no longer carried the sharp bite of winter. At Callaway Ridge, the ranch moved with a different kind of energy. The cattle were stronger, the fences had been repaired, the barns were full. And for the first time in years, Ethan Callaway looked like a man who was not simply surviving. He looked like a man living. Clara noticed it. She noticed small things. The way he stayed longer at the dinner table now. The way he no longer left a room the moment a conversation ended. The way he sometimes stopped beside the barn and watched the valley without the same heaviness in his eyes. But she also noticed something else. The tension. It had not disappeared. Nathaniel Brooks had made sure of that. Since the gathering, he had been telling anyone willing to listen that Storm had not truly changed, that Clara had simply been lucky. That one quiet evening with a horse did not erase years of danger. And perhaps most importantly, he kept reminding people of the letter, the false letter, the one that brought Clara to Callaway Ridge, the one that made everyone question why she was there. Ethan tried to ignore the talk, but Clara knew better. Words could travel farther than wagons in a small town. One morning, she found him standing near the pasture fence, looking toward the road. You're expecting someone, Ethan glanced at her. I suppose I am. Who? He did not answer immediately. Then he said, Nathaniel. Clara looked toward the distant trail. And Storm? Ethan's jaw tightened. He wants to see him. No, Ethan looked at her. No, he wants to see you fail. The honesty of the statement caught him off guard. A faint smile touched his face. You've become very good at reading people. Clara shrugged. I have had a lot of practice. That answer reminded him of everything she had endured before coming here. The people who dismissed her, the people who decided her worth before learning her name. Ethan stepped closer. You don't have to do this. Clara looked at him. Do what? Prove anything. She looked toward Storm's pasture. I'm not trying to prove myself. Then what are you doing? She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered. I'm trying to prove he deserves a chance. Ethan followed her eyes. The black stallion stood near the far fence, calm, watching. A year ago, that sight would have seemed impossible. Now it was simply part of the ranch, but Ethan still remembered the fear, the loss, the day everything changed. I don't want to lose you. The words came out before he could stop them. Clara turned. Ethan looked away, almost as if he regretted saying them. The silence between them stretched. Then Clara spoke softly. You won't. He looked back. Not a promise that nothing bad would happen. Not a promise that life would become easy. Something more honest. A promise that she was not walking away. The next afternoon, the Pine Hollow cattle gathering began. The valley came alive. Wagons lined the open field outside Callaway Ridge. Men traded supplies. Families shared meals. Children ran between the horses. A few musicians played near the old wooden tables, while people talked about cattle prices, weather, and the coming summer. But beneath all of it was another conversation. Storm. Clara could feel it. Every glance toward the barn, every quiet question, every person waiting. Beatrice Hollowell stood near the edge of the crowd beside Nathaniel Brooks. She looked confident. Too confident, Clara noticed. Ethan noticed too. Stay close, he said quietly. Clara looked at him. Because you're worried about Storm? He hesitated. No, that surprised her. Then why? His eyes moved towards the crowd. Because I know people, she understood. The horse was not the only thing being tested. When Nathaniel finally stepped forward, the conversations faded. Ethan, the ranch owner, faced him. Nathaniel, I think everyone here would appreciate seeing the famous stallion. A few people nodded, others remained silent. Ethan looked toward Storm's pasture, then toward Clara. She gave him a small nod, not because she wanted attention, because she knew this moment mattered. Ethan opened the gate. The crowd became quieter. Storm walked slowly into the open area. The reaction was immediate. Some people stepped back, some whispered. Even after all this time, fear remained. The stallion lifted his head. His ears moved. His eyes searched the crowd. Clara stepped forward, not too close, just enough, easy. Her voice was calm. Storm looked toward her. The noise around them faded. For a moment, Clara forgot about everyone watching. There was only the horse. Only the connection they had built one quiet evening at a time. Nathaniel crossed his arms. Interesting. Clara ignored him. She watched Storm. The horse took one step, then another. A few people gasped. Nobody expected him to move calmly, especially not toward her. But then a loud sound came from the crowd. A dropped metal bucket. The sharp crash echoed across the field. Storm reacted. His body stiffened. The crowd moved backward. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. Clara, but she raised one hand, not toward him, toward the moment. She did not run. She did not fight. She simply stood still. Storm breathed heavily. The old fear returned. The fear everyone remembered. The reason people had called him impossible. Clara lowered her voice. I know. The horse watched her. I know you're scared. The crowd became silent. Even Nathaniel stopped smiling. Clara took one slow step, then another. You don't have to prove anything either. Storm's ears moved. Ethan watched without breathing, because he understood something. Clara was not controlling the horse. She was speaking to him, the same way she had spoken to Ethan, the same way she had spoken to herself. Slowly, Storm lowered his head. The entire field went quiet. Clara reached out, not quickly, not forcing. She waited. The horse moved forward, one step, then another, and finally, the black stallion touched his nose against her hand. A sound moved through the crowd, not a cheer, not yet, something quieter. Shock. Ethan stood frozen. The horse that had carried so much fear, the horse that had been blamed, the horse everyone had given up on, had chosen trust. Nathaniel's expression changed. For once, he had nothing to say. Beatrice looked away, because she knew what everyone else now knew. The story she had helped create was falling apart. Clara stood beside Storm beneath the Montana sky. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Nathaniel. She looked at Ethan. And in that moment, he saw something he had never seen before. Not a woman who needed saving, not someone who needed a place to belong. A woman who had found her strength long before anyone recognized it. The valley had come expecting a failure. Instead, they witnessed something none of them could explain. A frightened horse choosing trust, and a lonely cowboy realizing he had been standing beside the answer all along. But before the day ended, Beatrice Hollowell would reveal the papers she carried, and Clara would learn that freedom was not always given. Sometimes it had to be claimed. The field outside Callaway Ridge had never been so quiet. Hundreds of people stood beneath the wide Montana sky, yet no one spoke. The wind moved through the grass, a horse shifted somewhere near the wagons, a child whispered something to his mother and was quickly hushed. Everyone was watching Clara Whitfield, and everyone was watching Storm. The black stallion stood beside her, his head lowered, his breath visible in the cool spring air. For years, people had told the same story. Storm was dangerous. Storm was impossible. Storm was the horse that took away Daniel Callaway, but standing there in the sunlight. Clara did not see a monster. She saw an animal that had spent years waiting for someone to understand him. Slowly, she placed her hand against his neck. Storm did not pull away. A murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan heard it, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed on Clara because he knew what this moment meant, not just for the horse, for her. The woman who arrived at his ranch carrying a small bag and a lifetime of people telling her she was not enough. The woman who cleaned stalls when everyone expected her to quit. The woman who sat outside a locked stall when everyone else walked away. She was not standing there trying to prove she was worthy. She was standing there because she already knew she was. Nathaniel Brooks stepped forward. His confident expression had disappeared. "This proving," he said. The crowd turned toward him. A few people looked uncomfortable. Nathaniel cleared his throat. A calm moment does not erase years of behavior. Clara looked at him. For once, she did not look nervous. She did not look like the woman who had sat quietly in Beatrice Hollowell's office months earlier. She looked steady. "Perhaps not," she said. Nathaniel seemed surprised by her answer. Clara continued, "But it proves something important." She looked at Storm. "It proves he is not what people decided he was." The words settled over the field because everyone understood. She was not only talking about the horse. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. He understood better than anyone. The crowd remained silent. Then Storm moved, not suddenly, not violently. He simply lowered his head against Clara's shoulder. A small gesture. Almost nothing, but everyone saw it. The same horse that had refused every trainer, the same horse that had made grown men step backward, had chosen her. A woman most people in Pine Hollow had already judged. The silence became something else. Respect. Then came the sound of a wagon approaching. Everyone turned. Beatrice Hollowell stepped down first. The moment she arrived, Clara felt the air change. Beatrice was not alone. A man wearing a dark coat followed behind her carrying a leather folder. Ethan recognized him. Samuel Pierce. The man nodded. Mr. Callaway. He was a lawyer from Helena, a careful man, the kind who measured every word before speaking. Ethan's expression hardened. "What is this?" Beatrice adjusted her gloves. "We need to discuss Clara." Clara felt her stomach tighten. The lawyer opened the folder. Miss Whitfield was placed under the care of the Pine Hollow Relief Society 6 years ago. The crowd became quiet again. During that arrangement, the society provided housing and support. Clara listened. She knew this story, but she did not know where it was going. The lawyer removed several documents. According to these records, Miss Whitfield's assistance was conditional. Ethan stepped forward. "Conditional," Beatrice answered, until she could support herself. Clara looked at her, and Beatrice smiled faintly. And she has not completed the requirements. The words felt familiar, too familiar, like being back in that office, like being told her life belonged to someone else. Ethan's voice became colder. She has worked every day since she arrived. Beatrice looked at him. This is not about your opinion. Clara watched Ethan's hands tighten, but he stayed quiet, because this was her battle, not his, the lawyer continued. Miss Whitfield was sent to Callaway Ridge because the Relief Society believed employment here would allow her to become independent. He glanced at the documents. However, the original agreement states that if she cannot fulfill the terms of employment, responsibility returns to the organization. Clara stared. What terms? Nobody answered immediately. Then Beatrice said, the ranch work, a pause, and the horse. The crowd shifted. Clara looked toward Storm. She understood. This was never just about a job. It was another test, another way for someone else to decide whether she had earned the right to choose her own life. Nathaniel watched quietly, Ethan noticed. And suddenly, everything became clear. The rumors, the challenge, the gathering, all of it had been leading here. Beatrice had not come to see Storm. She had come to use him. If she fails, Beatrice said calmly, she returns to Pine Hollow. The words echoed, returns, as if Clara had never truly left, as if this place had only been temporary. Ethan looked at Clara. He expected anger, fear, something, but what he saw was different. Pain, quiet and familiar, the same pain she carried when she first arrived. The belief that people could take away her choices whenever they wanted. Clara stepped forward. May I see the documents? Beatrice raised an eyebrow. You? Yes. The lawyer handed them to her. Clara read carefully. She was not a lawyer. She did not understand every word, but she understood enough, the agreement, the signatures, the dates. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved over one page. Something changed. What is this? Beatrice's expression shifted slightly. What? Clara held the paper up. This says the requirement was successful employment. Yes, and this says the employer must confirm the work was completed. The lawyer looked closer. Clara continued, Mr. Callaway has not signed anything saying I failed. Silence. Nathaniel's face changed. Beatrice stepped forward. You misunderstand. No. Clara's voice remained calm. I think I understand. She looked at Ethan, then back at Beatrice. You sent me here expecting me to fail. Nobody spoke. The truth was too obvious now. Beatrice's expression tightened. That is an accusation. Clara shook her head. No, she folded the paper carefully. It is the truth. The crowd looked between them. For the first time, Clara was not the woman being judged. She was the one asking questions. The lawyer reviewed the documents again, then slowly lowered them. Mrs. Hollowell. Beatrice looked at him. The agreement does state that successful employment fulfills the arrangement. Her face changed, only slightly, but enough. Clara saw it. So did Ethan. The trap had failed, but Beatrice was not finished. This is not over. Clara looked at her. A year ago, those words would have frightened her. Now they did not. Maybe not. She looked toward Storm. But it is not yours anymore. The crowd stayed silent because everyone understood. Clara Whitfield was no longer asking permission to belong. She was claiming the life she had built. And Ethan Callaway knew the hardest part was not over. Because now that Clara was finally free, he had to find the courage to ask her to stay. But before Ethan Callaway could speak the words waiting inside him, the past had to be faced. The crowd slowly began to leave Callaway Ridge as the afternoon light faded over the valley. The cattle gathering was over, the wagons rolled away, The voices disappeared down the road toward Pine Hollow, but the silence left behind felt heavier than the noise. Clara stood near the barn holding the folded documents in her hands. She had won. That was what everyone kept telling her. The agreement was complete. She was free. No more relief society. No more waiting for someone else to decide where she belonged. No more being treated like a responsibility passed from one person to another. Yet she did not feel the way she imagined she would. She looked across the ranch, the fences she repaired, the barn she cleaned, the horses she cared for, the small room above the tack shed, where she had unpacked the same bag she carried away from Pine Hollow. This place had become part of her. And now she had a choice. A real choice, for the first time in her life. Ethan found her there as the sun lowered behind the mountains. He stopped a few steps away. "You should be celebrating." Clara looked down at the papers. "Should I?" "Yes." She gave a small smile. "That sounds like something you would say." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression became serious. "You're free." The words hung between them. Clara nodded. Yes, but neither of them moved, because they both knew what that meant. Freedom meant she could leave, and Ethan had no right to ask her not to. That thought bothered him more than he expected. For years, Ethan Calloway had believed needing someone was a weakness. He built his ranch alone. He made decisions alone. He carried grief alone. But now he stood beside a woman who had changed everything without ever trying to. And the idea of watching her ride away felt worse than any storm he had ever faced. Before he could speak, the sound of horses approached. They turned. A rider entered through the ranch gate, Thomas Whitfield. Clara froze. She had not seen him since the day she left Pine Hollow. Thomas removed his hat. He looked older, tired. Not the man she remembered from childhood, not the man who fixed fences and brought her apples from his farm. Just a man carrying regret. "Clara," she said nothing. Thomas looked between her and Ethan. "I heard what happened." Clara folded the documents. "Did you?" He nodded. "I should have come sooner." The words were quiet, but they did not erase the distance between them. "You knew." Thomas lowered his eyes. Clara's voice remained calm. "You knew Beatrice was sending me away." A long silence followed. Ethan watched carefully. Not because he wanted to interfere, because he understood this was something Clara needed to hear. Thomas removed his gloves. "I knew they were looking for a way to move you out of the Relief Society, and you said nothing." His shoulders dropped. "My farm was struggling." Clara stared at him. "Thomas, I owed money." The explanation sounded smaller than he expected. "I was afraid if I spoke against them, they would stop helping my family." Clara looked away. The wind moved through the grass. "So you let them send me away?" Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, the honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. I told myself you would be fine." Clara looked back. "That was easier than admitting you chose yourself." Thomas had no answer, because she was right. For years, Clara had wondered why people left, why kindness disappeared, why promises changed. And standing there, she finally understood something. Sometimes people did not abandon you because you lacked value. Sometimes they abandoned you because they lacked courage. Thomas stepped forward slightly. "I am sorry." Clara looked at him. The apology mattered, but it could not change the past. "I believe you are." A pause. "But I spent a long time believing something was wrong with me." Thomas looked down. "I know, no." Her voice softened. "You don't." She looked around the ranch. "At least not anymore." Thomas followed her eyes, and for the first time he saw what she had built, not because someone gave her a place, because she earned one. A few days later, Ethan rode with Clara into Pine Hollow, not because she needed protection, because she wanted to close that chapter of her life. The town looked different, or perhaps she did. The same buildings stood along Main Street. The same wooden signs hung above the stores. The same diner windows reflected the afternoon sun. But Clara no longer walked with her shoulders lowered. She entered the Relief Society office one final time. Beatrice was there. The room looked exactly the same desk, the same shelves, the same chair where Clara had sat months earlier while being told she was no longer wanted. Beatrice looked up. "So you came back." Clara placed the final document on the desk. "No pause. I came to return what was never yours to keep." Beatrice looked at the paper. Her expression tightened. "You think this changes everything?" Clara looked around the room. "No." She took a breath. "It changes me." Beatrice said nothing. Clara continued. "For a long time I believed every person who told me I was too much." Her voice remained steady. "Too difficult. Too much trouble. Not enough." She picked up her gloves. "But I know better now." For once, Beatrice had no response. Clara walked toward the door, then stopped. She looked back. "I hope someday you learn that helping people does not mean owning them." Then she left. Outside, Ethan waited beside the horses. He did not ask what happened. He did not need to. Clara climbed into the saddle, and as they rode back toward Callaway Ridge, the valley stretched ahead of them beneath the evening sky. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Ethan said, "You handled that better than I would have." Clara glanced at him. "That is because you would have argued. Yes, and I would have won." Ethan looked at her. A small smile appeared. "You probably would have. It was a simple moment, a quiet one." But Clara noticed. Ethan was smiling, really smiling. That night, the ranch settled into peace. Storm stood calmly in his pasture. The horses rested. The lanterns glowed near the barn. Clara packed her things, not because she planned to leave immediately, because she needed to know what came next. The next morning, Ethan found her near the ranch gate with her small bag. His heart dropped. "Clara," she turned. "I thought you might come." He looked at the bag. "You're leaving." She was quiet. For a moment I thought I had to. Ethan stepped closer. "But you don't." "No." A pause. "I don't." The morning air was cool. The mountains stood silent around them. Ethan had faced storms. He had faced loss. He had faced the possibility of losing his ranch. But this was different. Because this time, he was not asking someone to stay because he needed help. He was asking because he had finally found something worth building a life around. He looked at Clara, and after years of keeping everything inside, Ethan Callaway finally said the one thing he was most afraid to say. "Stay." Clara looked at him. Not because she did not hear, because she needed to know why, and Ethan knew exactly what she was asking. So he stepped closer. Not because of the ranch, a pause. Not because of Storm, his voice lowered. Because of me. The words were simple, but for Ethan, they carried years of silence, and Clara waited. Because the cowboy who had once locked away every feeling he had was finally opening the door. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The ranch gate stood open behind Clara. The road stretched beyond it. The same road she had traveled months earlier with a small bag in her hand and no idea where she would end up. Back then, she had left Pine Hollow because she had nowhere else to go. Now she stood there because she had somewhere she could choose to stay. That difference meant everything. Ethan looked at her carefully. He knew Clara, not completely. No one ever truly knew another person completely, but he knew enough. He knew she did not want promises made out of guilt. She did not want to be someone's responsibility. She had spent too many years being treated like something people had to carry. So Ethan chose his words carefully. "I spent a long time believing this ranch was all I needed." Clara said nothing. The morning wind moved softly through the fields. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I kept everything under control, I could keep anything from hurting me again. His eyes moved toward the mountains. Then you arrived. A small smile touched Clara's face. Arrived is one way to describe it. Ethan looked at her. For a moment, the old seriousness faded. I remember seeing you step off that wagon. Clara lowered her eyes. I remember. I thought someone had sent you here to make my problems worse. She gave a quiet laugh. That was not exactly my first impression of you either. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression softened. But I was wrong. The words were simple. Coming from Ethan Calloway, they meant more than a long speech. I thought I needed someone who could control Storm. He looked toward the pasture, but I didn't. A pause. I needed someone who could remind me that not everything broken had to be thrown away. Clara looked at him. The man standing before her was still Ethan, still quiet, still careful, but the walls around him were lower now. I was sent here as a joke, she whispered. Ethan shook his head. No. He stepped closer. You were sent here because people failed to see you. Clara looked down. The old pain was still there. Pain did not disappear just because someone finally understood it, but it no longer controlled her. Ethan continued. They saw your side. A pause. They saw your past. Another pause. They saw someone they thought would be easy to dismiss. His voice lowered. But they never saw your courage. Clara looked back at him. And you did? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. The honesty of it filled the space between them. Clara looked toward the ranch, the barn, the fields, the pasture where Storm stood calmly in the morning light. This place was never supposed to become home. Ethan followed her gaze. Maybe homes are not always the places we expect. She smiled slightly. That sounds almost like wisdom. Don't tell anyone. The small joke surprised her, and for a moment they both laughed, quietly, naturally. The kind of laughter that comes when two people finally stop trying so hard to protect themselves. Then Ethan became serious again. Clara, she looked at him. I don't want you to stay as a worker. A pause. I don't want you to stay because you owe me anything. He reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it. His fingers gently closed around hers. And because I am better with you in my life. Clara felt tears gather in her eyes. Not because she was sad, because for the first time, someone was asking her to stay. Not because they needed her, because they wanted her. Ethan took a breath. Then he said the words that changed everything. Stay with me. Clara looked at him. As what? Ethan's expression softened. As my equal. A pause. As my partner. Another pause. Then, with the same quiet certainty he used when making decisions on the ranch, he said, as my wife. The world seemed still, the mountains, the fields, the old wooden barn. Everything waited. Clara looked at the man who had once stood behind cold silence. The man who had lost his brother. The man who had believed loneliness was safer than love. And she saw what he was offering. Not a rescue, not a debt, a life. She looked down at their hands, then back at him. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. I have never been more sure of anything. A tear slipped down her cheek. This time she did not wipe it away. Yes, the word was quiet, but Ethan heard it. Yes, I'll stay. For a moment he simply stood there, as if he needed to make sure the answer was real. Then he pulled her into his arms, not desperately, not like someone afraid she would disappear, like someone who had finally found where he belonged. Behind them, Storm watched from the pasture. The black stallion lifted his head, then returned to the grass. Peaceful, the horse everyone believed could never change had found trust, and the cowboy everyone believed would always be alone had found something he never expected. A home. Months later, the first snow of winter covered Callaway Ridge. The valley became quiet again. The same mountains stood around the ranch. The same fields stretched toward the horizon. But everything felt different, because life had changed. Clara no longer slept in the small room above the tack shed. Her clothes hung beside Ethan's. Her sewing basket rested near the window of the main house. Her coffee mug sat beside his every morning. Small things, ordinary things, the things she once believed were not meant for her. Outside, the barn doors opened as sunlight spilled across the snow. Clara walked beside Ethan through the ranch yard. She carried a small basket of supplies. He carried a saddle that needed repair. "You know," Clara said, "the whole town still talks." Ethan glanced at her. "About what?" She smiled. "About how the woman they sent away ended up changing everything." Ethan shook his head. "They have the story wrong." Clara looked at him. "How so?" He looked toward the barn. "Because you didn't change the ranch." She waited. Ethan looked back at her. "You changed what it felt like to live here." Her smile softened. Inside the barn, Storm stood calmly in his stall. His old reputation was gone. People still respected him. They still remembered his past. But they no longer feared him. Clara stepped closer and rested her hand against his neck. Storm lowered his head. A simple gesture, a quiet reminder of how far everything had come. The woman nobody believed in, the horse nobody understood, the cowboy who believed he had lost too much to love again. All three had been judged before anyone truly knew them. And all three had found something they never expected: a second chance. Years later, people in Pine Hollow would still tell the story. They would talk about the wild black stallion. They would talk about the rancher who finally opened his heart. They would talk about the woman who arrived with one small bag and changed an entire valley. But Ethan Callaway always knew the truth. Clara Whitfield was never sent to break his horse. She was sent to break the silence around his heart. And when the world told her she had nowhere to belong, she found a home, and the cowboy asked her to stay forever. And maybe the most powerful part of Clara's journey was never the horse she learned to trust, or the ranch she helped rebuild. It was the moment she finally understood that her worth was never decided by the people who failed to see it. Imagine standing where Clara stood, carrying only a small bag, walking into a place where everyone has already decided your story before they know your name. Imagine wondering if you are only being tolerated, only being given a chance until someone finds a reason to send you away. Then imagine finding someone who does not ask you to become someone else, someone who sees your strength, your kindness, and the quiet courage you carried all along. Clara and Ethan's story reminds us that healing often begins when two wounded hearts stop hiding. Sometimes love is not about being rescued. Sometimes it is about finally being seen, respected, and chosen. If you were in Clara's place, would you have stayed at Callaway Ridge? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of love, second chances, mystery, and healing touch your heart, we invite you to subscribe. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you in the stories ahead.